This next presentation will review how to complete the grant proposal budget. The grant proposal phase budget should be expanded from that of the concept proposal phase and should be notably more detailed. Please note that for the grant proposal phase, all budget information should be provided in this budget template. If you have made any changes from the concept proposal phase, there is no need to resubmit or update that information. To begin, download the template from the budget narrative section in the Amplifund application or from the SCBGP website and save it to your computer. There are 11 pages total in the template, but there is no minimum or maximum number of pages for your completed budget narrative. We ask that you do not change the formatting of the template except to add or delete rows in the tables and rows. Please leave it as a Word document with 12-point Arial font and 1-inch margins. Since development of the budget is such an important part of the grant proposal, we would like to point out a few of the resources available for guidance in this process. First, the request for concept proposals is still a valuable reference for outlining USDA and CDFA requirements. Within the grant proposal instructions, you will find information about the federal cost principles, unallowable costs, indirect and direct costs, and travel in the requirements and limitations section, along with an example of a completed budget. More detailed information on allowable and unallowable costs can be found in the allowable and unallowable costs and activities table, available through a link in the grant proposal instructions and on the SCBGP website. The Procuring Goods and Services supplement provides guidance on the federal regulations for procurement transactions. A later presentation will cover this in more detail. For more information about the federal regulations to determine allowable costs and ensure consistent treatment of costs, you can access the federal cost principles through links in the GPI. Remember that state, local, or Indian tribal governments, nonprofits, colleges, and universities are subject to the 2 CFR 200, and for-profit organizations are subject to the 48 CFR subpart 31.2. Remember, if you have questions, we encourage you to participate in our question and answer process. Within the budget narrative, you'll provide a detailed breakdown and justification for all project costs. As you develop your grant proposal budget, ensure that all costs are necessary for the project, well justified, and clearly linked to the project activities and objectives. It should be clear why costs are requested and how they relate to the activities listed in the project objectives and work plan. We understand that your budget narrative is a best estimate based on current information. However, we ask that you do your homework to make sure your estimates are reasonable and are not over or understated. Providing a breakdown of the cost per unit helps clarify how the estimate for each cost was calculated. Please do not enter any number without a breakdown or explanation. Costs should also be consistent with the application organization's established practices. Finally, all costs must be allowable per the federal cost principles and USDA and CDFA requirements. If your project is selected for funding, CDFA will remove all unallowable costs and activities as a condition of receiving an award, which means the budget could be decreased and project activities could be affected. Now let's review the template. The budget narrative is divided into 9 categories. The first 8 categories, A through H, will determine the total SCBGP funds requested. There is a program income category at the end of the budget narrative that should only be completed if the project includes activities that will generate income during the grant duration. I'll go over this category in more detail later in the presentation. At the top of the budget narrative, enter the title assigned to your project in Amplifund. Also enter the total amount of SCBGP funds requested for your project. As mentioned, this is the sum of budget narrative categories A through H and should match the amount listed under funds requested in Amplifund. Please make sure the total amount requested is within the allowable range and rounded to the nearest dollar. Category A is for the salary and wages expense for employees working on the project. This section should only include people employed by the applicant organization and whose time and effort will be covered by SCBGP funds. If people from other organizations will be paid with grant funds, those costs should be listed under contractual. In the salary and wages table provided, enter each employee's name if known, and their title or role in the project. Note that if the name of the employee is not yet known, enter to be determined. Please ensure that the title of the employee in the budget matches the title used in the work plan. A common mistake is to use slightly different titles for the same individual in each section, such as IT consultant versus software consultant. If the project will have multiple employees with the same title, please differentiate them in some way, such as student worker A and student worker B, or by using their last names after their title. Next, enter the level of effort as a percent full-time equivalent or number of hours to be worked over the entire grant duration. If the percent full-time equivalent will change over the course of the project, please put the average percent full-time equivalent. For example, if an employee will work 100% full-time equivalent in year 1 and 50% for the remaining 1 year and 8 months, the average full-time equivalent would be 73.33%. Finally, enter the funds requested for the individual. Below the table, provide a justification for each employee listed. Briefly summarize their duties and identify the project objectives that each employee will be responsible for completing. Include the objective numbers from the project objectives and work plan template. It is important to note that every person who will be paid with grant funds must be responsible for activities and included in the project objectives and work plan. To calculate the funds requested for a salaried employee, multiply their annual salary by the grant duration, which is 2.75 years, then by their percent full-time equivalent. If they will be working only some of the grant duration, or the activities will occur over a shorter duration, adjust the duration multiplier. To calculate the funds requested for an hourly employee, multiply their hourly wage by the number of hours to be worked over the entire grant duration. Here is an example of a budget that includes 3 employees. Below the table, there's a justification for each employee working on the project. Note that each employee's justification must identify which project objectives their activities will support. Category B is for the fringe benefits expenses for employees working on the project. Fringe benefits include benefits such as paid leave, health insurance, and unemployment, and is calculated as a percentage of an employee's salary or wages. This percentage should be determined in accordance with the applicant organization's established fringe benefits policy. In the table provided, enter each employee's name and their title or role in the project as it was done in the personnel table. Then enter the fringe benefits rate and the funds requested. To calculate the funds requested for each employee, multiply their salary and wages by their fringe benefit rate. Here's an example of an employee that will receive $55,000 in salary for work on the SCBGP project, as noted in the personnel category, and has a fringe benefit rate of 19%. 19% of $55,000 is $10,450, which is entered under funds requested. The same calculation should be performed for each employee listed. Project-related travel expenses will be listed in Category C. The expenses listed here should be in support of project activities for all individuals except contractual personnel. If the project has contractors that will be traveling as well, those costs should be listed under the contractual section. Costs must not exceed those established by the United States General Services Administration or GSA. These rates vary by location, so be sure to look up the appropriate rates using the GSA website. If selected for funding, your travel budget will be reduced to meet the more reasonable rate of the applicant organization's established travel policy or the GSA rates. For each trip included in the travel table, the following information will need to be provided. First, the trip starting and destination location by city and state. If the exact destination is not yet known, please indicate that the destination is to be determined. However, ensure costs are reasonable. If needed, use an approximate destination city as a basis for calculating the travel costs requested, such as the last known location of a conference. This is important since GSA rates can vary widely within a state, county, or region. Do not list a county or general area. Each type of expense for a given trip should be indicated on a separate line in the table. I'll show you an example of this on the next slide. Within the same line for each type of expense, specify the unit of measure, the number of units, the cost per unit, the number of individuals claiming that expense, and the total funds requested for the expense. Below the table, indicate the approximate dates of travel for each trip and provide an explanation of how the trip will achieve the project objectives and outcomes. Again, be sure to include the objective numbers from the project objectives and work plan template. And remember to include all trips as activities within the work plan. This example includes 4 separate trips. For trip 1, the destination is Monterey, California, and there are 3 associated expenses: mileage, hotel, and meals. On the mileage line, 360 miles are requested at a cost of 65.5 cents per mile. There is only one person claiming the mileage expense because both people will be traveling together in the same car. Multiplying these 3 numbers results in $236 under funds requested. The next expense is lodging. The unit measure is nights, and the number of units requested is 3. The total cost per unit for the hotel is $184 per night, which is in accordance with the GSA rate for Monterey in the month of November. 2 people will be traveling, so 2 separate hotel rooms are requested, for a total lodging cost of $1,104. The third and fourth expenses requested are for meals. Note that the rate for per diem is different for the first and last day of travel, where only 2 meals can be claimed, versus full travel days, where 100% of the per diem can be claimed. Please check to be sure the GSA website for both first and last day of travel and full per diem rates, as CDFA may remove costs over the allowable GSA rates as a condition of receiving funding, which means that indicating the full rate instead of the first and last day of travel could result in the budget being decreased. For these lines in the table, the unit of measure is days, and the number of days requested is 2 each. There is the first day of travel, then 2 full days of travel, and the last day of travel. The cost per unit for meals is $55.50 per day in accordance with the GSA rate for Monterey for the first and last day of travel, and $74 for the full days of travel, and meals are requested for both people traveling, which totals $222 and $296 respectively. The expenses are broken out in the same way for the remaining 3 trips in the example, and the total for all travel is provided at the bottom of the table. In addition, for each trip, provide a justification including the approximate dates of travel, an indication of who will be traveling, the city of origin and the destination city, and the purpose of the trip. Also note the objective number from the project objectives and work plan template to show the project objectives that each travel supports. Category D is for costs to purchase scientific research equipment required for the project. To be considered scientific research equipment, an item must cost $5,000 or more per item and must be used only for research or scientific activities. Scientific research equipment is non-expendable and tangible personnel property with useful life of more than 1 year. This includes items like specialized microscopes, spectrometers, and other lab equipment. Note that all non-scientific items that cost more than $5,000 are considered general purpose equipment. Cost to purchase general purpose equipment are unallowable under the SCBGP. However, general purpose equipment needed for the project may be rented. Cost for rented equipment should be included in budget category G, Other. In the table provided, enter the name and manufacturer of the item, the grant year when the equipment will be purchased, and the amount of funds requested. Below the table, provide a justification for each piece of scientific research equipment that includes an explanation for why the equipment is necessary for the project and how it will be used to achieve the project objectives and outcomes, along with the objective numbers from the project objectives and work plan template. In this example, the project will require one piece of scientific research equipment. The name and manufacturer of the item are provided in the table. As required for this budget category, the item costs more than $5,000. Provided below the table is a justification describing why the equipment is needed and how it directly is linked to the project objectives. Category E is for cost to purchase project supplies. Supplies include any items costing less than $5,000 per unit and are used exclusively for the objectives of the project. The supplies category should not include any general office supplies such as paper, printer ink, or pens, as these are considered indirect costs. Those are not allowable as direct costs unless they are solely and specifically used for a project activity and can be directly assigned to such an activity relatively easily with a high degree of accuracy. All supplies must be tied to specific project activities. In the table provided, enter the type of supply to be purchased, the cost per unit, the number of units, the grant year in which the supply will be purchased, and the total funds requested for the supply. Below the table, provide a justification for each supply describing how the supply will be used to achieve the project objectives and outcomes. Objective numbers should be provided from the project objectives and work plan template. A common error made by applicants is to not break down supply costs sufficiently. Note that it is not appropriate to group costs together excessively. For example, laboratory supplies should be broken down into its constituent parts, such as reagents, pipettes, gloves, etc. Here's an example of the supplies table. The per cost unit for supply 1, sample containers, is listed as $5 for a pack of 20 and 4 packs are required. $5 per pack times 4 packs results in $20 under funds requested. The funds requested for the rest of the supplies in the example is calculated in the same way, and the total for all supplies is provided at the bottom of the table. Please note again that the amount in the cost per unit column should not exceed $5,000. Any item with a purchase price that is equal to or exceeds $5,000 per unit should not be included here. However, note that the amount in the funds requested column may exceed the $5,000 total. Below the table is a brief justification explaining why the supplies are needed and are directly related to the project objectives. A more detailed explanation than what is provided here may be needed depending on the supply requested. Please note that you may group the justification here for supplies if they are used for the same activity and same objective, as seen here with supplies 1 through 6. Category F is for expenses associated with purchasing goods and/or procuring services performed by an individual or organization other than the applicant in the form of a procurement relationship. Projects with contractual costs must provide the following: the name of each contractor, the fee structure for each contractor, for example, salary and wages, fees for professional services, or a flat rate, and the total amount of funds requested for each contractor. Below the table, provide a justification for each contractor that describes the project activities that the contractor will accomplish and identifies the project objectives the contractual services will support from the project objectives and work plan template. Again, it's important to note that every person, including contractors, who will be paid with grant funds must be responsible for activities in the project objectives and work plan. Additional justification is required if a contractor's salary and wages or fee for professional services exceeds the General Schedule Pay Scale or GS 15 Step 10. The GS15 Step 10 provides a guideline for contractual rates as determined by the Office of Management and Budget for your area and can be accessed using the link provided in the budget narrative template. This is an example of a project with two contractors. The table lists the contractor organizations, specifies the fee structure that will be used for each, and indicates the total amount of funds requested. Below the table is a justification for each contractor. The justification for Contractor 1 explains why a salary in excess of the GS15 Step 10 is appropriate. The justification for Contractor 2 details why a flat rate structure is used. Keep in mind that this is just a general example. Please ensure you provide adequate detail and thoroughly justify your contractual expenses. Within the contractual budget category, in addition to the contractual table and justifications, an additional breakdown of expenses is required for contractors using a salary and wages or fee for professional services fee structure. For these fee structures, a breakdown of all costs for the budget categories A through H is required. Tables are provided for the first contractor and can be copied as needed for additional contractors. Please note that a breakdown of costs is not required for flat rate contracts because all associated costs such as supplies and travel are included in the flat rate. In the example from before, Contractor 1 will use a salary and wages fee structure, so a breakdown of costs for categories A through H is required. Contractor 2 will use a flat rate fee structure, so a breakdown of costs for categories A through H is not required because all of these costs are included in the flat rate. This is what the breakdown should look like for a contractor using a salary and wages or fee for professional services fee structure. This example only shows budget categories A and B, but a breakdown should be provided for all budget categories where expenses are expected. If one or more cost areas are not required for a contractor, simply leave that section blank. There is one set of blank tables provided, so copy these tables for each additional contractor as needed. For a more thorough example, review the sample budget narrative provided in Appendix C of the grant proposal instructions. Category G is where project-related expenses not covered in any of the other categories should be listed. Expenses listed under this category can include costs for hosting meetings, conference registration fees, rental expenses, printing or postage costs, and publishing project results in professional journals. In the table provided, enter a description of the expense, the cost per unit, the number of units to be purchased, when the expense will be expected, and the funds requested. For each expense listed in the table, provide a justification describing how it will be used to achieve the project objectives and outcomes. Lastly, identify the objective numbers from the project objectives and work plan template for each expense listed. Note that if costs for meals or refreshments for meeting attendees are requested, a reasonable justification is needed to support that the meal is necessary and is not an entertainment cost. Be sure to provide the estimated number of attendees and the cost per meal, which cannot exceed the GSA rate for the meeting location. In this example, there are two expenses. As with the other categories in the budget narrative, multiply the cost per unit times the number of units needed to determine the amount of funds requested. The justification explains why the costs are needed and how they relate to the project objectives. And finally, category H is for indirect costs. Indirect costs are costs that cannot be identified directly with a particular project, program, or organizational activity. These include things like IT services, rent, utilities and internet service, general office supplies, insurance, and maintenance. Indirect costs are calculated as a percentage of total personnel costs. In the table provided, enter the total personnel costs, which are the sum of Category A personnel plus Category B fringe benefits, the indirect cost rate, which is 8% maximum, and the funds requested. In this example, the total personnel cost is $94,860. The indirect cost rate requested is 8%, so the total indirect funds requested is $7,589. Note that an indirect cost amount exceeding 8% of total personnel costs may result in a project being disqualified. The program income category is where you will describe any income that your project might generate as a result of grant-supported activities during the period of performance. An example of a source of program income would be registration fees for events hosted as a result of grant activities. Most projects will not generate any program income, and no preference is assigned either way. Program income cannot be used as profit and must be spent before the end of the grant period in compliance with restrictions on allowable and unallowable costs and activities. And the table provided include a description of the source of program income or how the project will generate program income and how it will be used to enhance the competitiveness of specialty crops. A detailed explanation of how the income will be reinvested into the project in support of project activities, and the total amount of estimated program income. In this example, the applicant will generate $1,500 in program income by charging a $50 workshop registration fee. The income will be reinvested back into the project and will be used to enhance specialty crops. If your project will generate program income, an explanation of the specific activities that will be paid for with program income must be provided. When all sections of the budget narrative are complete and the final version is saved on your computer, you are ready to attach or upload the document to your grant proposal application using the Attachments tab in Amplifund. The budget narrative must be attached as a Word document. Please do not submit a PDF file or any other file type. Given that the budget is a key part of the overall grant proposal, there are a few issues related to the budget narrative template that could result in disqualification of a grant proposal. These include forgetting to attach a budget narrative, attaching a blank file by mistake, attaching an unreadable or corrupt file, modifying the template, using a previous year's version of the template, or accidentally attaching the wrong file. Also, requesting a total amount of SCBGP funds that is less than $100,000 or greater than $500,000, requesting indirect costs in excess of 8% total of personnel costs, or including excessive unallowable costs. And finally, a few reminders to keep in mind as you work. Please do not include any cost sharing or references to cost sharing in the budget narrative. This includes practices such as stating that SCBGP will pay for a percentage of costs. The budget narrative should include only costs that will be paid for with SCBGP funds. Be sure to round all costs to the nearest dollar, and please double check your math to make sure everything adds up and your totals are correct. There's a lot of detail required in the budget narrative, and CDFA encourages getting an early start. Again, remember that we are available to answer your questions. Questions should be sent via email and received before the deadline on January 8th at 8 a.m. This concludes the budget narrative presentation. Please give us a few moments to review the questions we have received, and we'll be right back with you.